Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'm going to be starting a bit of a series of videos related to Survivor finales. Now, to celebrate the premiere of Survivor 41, I did do a ranking of every premiere episode in the history of the show, and the plan was to always do the same thing for the finale of Survivor 41 in ranking the finale episodes. However, that process is obviously a very long one, and because of how much time that video would take to make, I decided, you know what? Let's kill multiple birds with one stone here. While I'm watching all these Survivor finales, I might as well do a couple other rankings that I've always wanted to do in association with those finales. And this will be the first of those rankings. This will be my rankings of every final tribal in the history of the show. Now, this ranking will almost solely be based around entertainment value. I mean, this is how much I personally enjoy watching these final tribals, how much intrigue I feel like there is in the final tribal, whether that be from how the players are performing, whether that be from the questions they are asked, whether that be from how bitter the jury is. Like, all those elements come together here. So we'll be ranking the 40 final tribals, and let's just jump right into it. At number 40 for me, a tribal that I kind of just find kind of boring, if I'm being honest, which is kind of bizarre considering this is one of my all-time favorite seasons, but the final tribal itself just isn't that entertaining, and that is Survivor Pearl Islands. And really, for me, there's just almost nothing of note during this final tribal here. I mean, the most notable thing here is Lil and her talking about how she wish she didn't wear her Boy Scout uniform, and she does get some hate for that. Again, Rupert is really bitter at Lil. But outside of that, there's not much really memorable here. You get really boring questions. From what I understand, Fair Play did have a very harsh speech for Lil that was cut out of the main show, but again, it's not on the show. Based on what we're showing on the show, it's really boring. I didn't get much entertainment out of this. It's at the bottom here at number 40. At number 39, we're going to a season that I don't like nearly as much, and another final tribal that I find mostly boring, and that is Survivor the Australian Outback. And for me, this is just kind of a soulless final tribal here, where it doesn't feel like any of the jurors ask anything memorable. There's no fun character moments the entire way through. The only reason it is above Pearl Islands is because I do feel like there is at least this notable, terrible performance from Colby along the way. And even Tina gives a very underwhelming winning final tribal performance here. And those things kind of stick to my mind, but there's nothing individual here that is super memorable. You just see both of these players kind of waste opportunities at gaining favor with the jury. And that's the main source of entertainment here. Again, not the greatest final tribal in my eyes. It's here number 39. And now for number 38, where we're jumping to a modern season of the show. And actually the next few are from modern seasons, with the first one here being Survivor Co Wrong. Now, Co Wrong for me is another final tribal that I just don't find that interesting. I think on paper you would think it would be, considering there was this Michelle versus Aubrey debate that obviously took the internet by storm afterwards. But when we're looking at the actual final tribal itself, it does feel very rushed, which is something that you definitely notice from these later final tribals that involve the older format of the show. And I do think this is one of those final tribals that does show the flaw in the older format. While I do still like the older format of each juror getting their own chance to speak, I do think I have grown a further appreciation for the modern format after having rewatched some of these tribals. As I do feel, I feel like they were struggling in the last few tribals that they went through with the older format to really show things properly. And for me, Co Wrong just kind of feels, it feels kind of soulless. There's nothing that interesting happening here. I think Scott has a kind of memorable speech where he kind of gives a David Murphy speech for Michelle. You do have stuff involving Mark the Chicken here where Ty brings him the final tribal. But overall, just a very unmemorable final tribal here, despite it clearly being one that should have been memorable considering how divisive this jury decision was. And with that, we move on to number 37, another tribal in this era of the show. We are moving on to Survivor Cambodia. Again, another final tribal that I feel like is very rushed, kind of similar to Co Wrong. I don't feel like there's that much intrigue here going on with the questions. Definitely more so than Korong. I mean, we do have a bit more notable moments here. I mean, we have Wigglesworth telling them to pick a number. Again, a callback to the first season. We have Savage. And this is something you kind of notice when rewatching these later finales with this format, is that they kind of relegate one person to kind of waste their jury question in order to like introduce Tribal. But Savage is one of the few ones here that does that, but then also goes on to do his own question, where he really just like berates Jeremy and Spencer for how they were acting throughout the season. Like Jeremy for his treatment of Kimmy, and Spencer for like the arrogance he showed at the previous Tribal and threatening Jeremy. And it's like, that stuff's notable. You have Jeremy revealing that Val was pregnant. That's cool too. But I mean, overall, I don't feel like this one stands up to a lot of the ones that we'll be talking about later, where like almost every other question outside of the ones I just mentioned are super forgettable, with there being no real like massive blunders from the players either. Like there's really not much of note in this Tribal outside of, again, Savage, Wigglesworth, and that's barely anything, and then Jeremy talking about Val. That's pretty much it. Now at number 36, another modern Tribal, but this is actually the first with the current format. And here we do have David versus Goliath, which I just feel like overall is just such an unmemorable final Tribal. Again, there's a couple notable moments here. I think the first one, you have Angelina exaggerating everything because, I mean, she's Angelina. And then you have a like fun moment with Christian where Jeff is trying to move on in Final Tribal, saying, are we good with the social game? And then Christian just says, F no, and that's hilarious. But it's like, overall, I mean, there's not much going on in this Final Tribal. Like, there's not much bickering. I think that's one of the best things about this current format, is how dynamic Final Tribal is, where there's a lot of fighting in between players and the jury members. It feels a lot more fluid. I do think it is overall probably more entertaining as a whole, even though it does get rid of this element of there being like these bitter speeches that are very memorable in my mind. But I feel like David vs. Goliath is the one that doesn't take advantage of that new format, where again, you don't have much bickering between Nick, Angelina, or Mike. Like, they're mostly focused on themselves. Like, there's like a little moment here and there, like Nick shakes his head to Angelina. You have like Mike asking Nick a question in the middle of one of his responses. Like, I mean, it's very minor things. And for me, it's just not a super memorable Final Tribal. It's here at number 36. At number 35, another recent Final Tribal, and this is actually the most recent Final Tribal, and that is Winners at War, which I did not think was going to be this low. I mean, this is a Final Tribal that I remembered liking at the time. I did remember really liking Tony in particular during this Final Tribal, where he's just making the entire jury laugh the entire way through. I do remember that all three of them fought pretty hard, which is still the case. But I do think in comparison to a lot of the other Final Tribals, there just isn't that much here that's super memorable. It's like, again, like Tony's performance is cool to see. You have like Rob and like Parvati asking Tony like how he did it, and that's like a cool thing to see, these like Survivor legends being confused at how Tony played as well as he did. Like, that's cool. You have him talking about his spy nest, and that's kind of funny. But it's like, overall, like I just don't really have that much else to say about this Tribal. I mean, like Tony, Natalie, and Michelle, like while they all give solid Final Tribal performances, again, there's not much bickering between the three. Like, they mostly just stick with saying what they need to say without actually arguing with each other, which again, I think is the best part of this format. So without that element of it, and with most of the Tribal just kind of being pretty baseline, I do feel like Winners of War ends up landing here at number 35. Now at number 34, moving back to the older format, we do have another mostly uneventful Final Tribal, but we are moving on to Survivor Panama. Now, Panama for me, again, I do think there's a couple notable moments here. You have Courtney being Courtney during her question, talking about how she's a bird and she's going to fly, and that's bizarre. But then you also have Terry, who comes off bitter to Danielle, and I thought that was interesting. You have Shane, who is really fun, as you would expect, telling them that they're both undeserving and then asks for a number. Again, that's fun, but I do feel like the other four questions from the jury members are super forgettable. Plus, also, Danielle and Aris aren't particularly entertaining in their own right at Final Tribal here. So for me, it is a mostly uneventful Tribal, though I do feel like the Shane moment in particular stands out to me as something to put it above those other ones we just talked about. So it's here at number 34. Now number 33, another Final Tribal that I kind of have very similar opinions of, and that is Survivor the Amazon. Again, another Final Tribal that is mostly forgettable, but there are a couple notable moments here. And first up, you have the branch almost falling on Butch right at the start of it. Like, that's kind of hilarious. You also have the Heidi question, which is just kind of funny. I mean, like, a lot of it's in the way it's presented, because, like, in reality, supposedly what she was trying to do is trying to get Jenna to say Dina, to try to get Dina to vote for Jenna, but the way it comes off makes it seem, obviously, that Heidi is waiting for them to prop her up, which is kind of funny. But outside that, I mean, like, it is, again, not a super memorable Final Tribal. I mean, a lot of the other questions are kind of just fine. I do feel like the baseline for the remaining questions is higher than that of, like, a Panama, which is why it is higher than Panama here. Like, I do think there's a lot of talk about hating honesty and loyalty, and I thought that was interesting, especially for a Final Tribal this early on. You have Dave's, like, ridiculous question asking the players to compare themselves to political leaders, and, like, Matt's answer of Colin Powell is just, like, so random. And I love that, like, Jenna doesn't even bother answering the question, just talks about her mom instead. Like, I mean, there's definitely stuff memorable here, but it's far in between, and because of that, it does still land here at 33. At 32, again, another older school Final Tribal here. And for me, this is kind of the end of this bottom tier of the list, in my opinion, and that is Survivor Marquesas. Now, Marquesas is one that, again, I think there's a super memorable moment here in Tammy's speech, which, again, comes off as super hypocritical on her end, but it does have some memorable moments, like her calling Nalia greedy for trying to win the game. You have John Caro, who does have a really fun energy in his question. You have Pascal calling Nalia and Vesepia the epitome of what this great country has to offer, which is just such a ridiculous line. And you have, like, pretty notable Final Tribal performances here, not in a good way. I mean, Nalia has one of the worst Final Tribal performances ever here, talking about how she didn't even play the game until, like, day 24. You also have, like, Kathy being really bitter at Vesepia, and that's really interesting. So, I mean, like, there's definitely memorable stuff here. It's definitely not the worst tribal here, but I do think, again, outside of the things I just mentioned, it is pretty slow, and that's still over half the questions. So, again, a tribal that does have memorable moments, but again, they are far in between. But I do feel like these moments are more notable to me than the ones from the Amazon, so that's why this one's higher here at number 32. Now moving on to number 31, and we're kind of outside of the Final Tribals that I would consider kind of boring for the most part. I think from this point on, like, every Final Tribal is pretty consistently entertaining, though obviously this next batch are not as strong as the ones that will come later, obviously. So here at number 31, we're actually moving back to the modern format, and another Final Tribal that wasn't as dynamic as I would have liked it to be, and that is Survivor Edge of Extinction. Now, I do think this one is, again, it's mostly just fine. You have Chris, Gavin, and Julie all really fighting here, all having very different arguments for why they should win the game. Chris obviously has this really notable moment of him talking about the negative reverse, which makes him sound really intelligent when describing his move to have Lauren flush the idol. Again, that's a really noble moment for me. You have Gavin bashing on the Edge of Extinction, which is a particularly bad move on this season. I think that was another notable moment for me. And really for me, it's like, it is a consistently entertaining tribal. There's no real slow point here. Again, you have these people fighting it the entire way. It does feel like the jury was more interactive here, especially in comparison to something like a David vs. Goliath, which we've already talked about. So again, I do feel like this is a better Final Tribal, but still one that isn't particularly notable, but one that I did find consistently entertaining, but still not enough to make it much higher here than number 31. And now number 30, we're moving on to a Final Tribal that I definitely thought was going to be lower on the list, and that is Blood versus Water. Now, for me, this is a Final Tribal that is pretty much solely determined by one thing, and that is Monica. Because, like, really, most of this tribal is people bashing on Monica, and Monica, like, really emotionally responding to people. Where you have people like Laura and Hayden talking about they don't even know who she is, and you have Monica, like, crying as she's, like, talking about how she wanted to win this for Monica. And, like, that stuff is pretty entertaining here. I mean, the rest of the tribal is kind of just your baseline Final Tribal, like, nothing particularly interesting, but nothing bad either. But because most of the tribal is actually just Monica getting berated and that being somewhat entertaining, I did feel like this deserved to be a tier above those bottom tiered Final Tribals. So it's here number 30. At number 29 is a Final Tribal that I actually thought was going to be higher on the list. I remember really liking this Final Tribal in the past, but then rewatching it, like, it's not that great, actually, and that is Survivor One World. Now, I do think you start off with, like, Jonas wanting to be called Master Jonas, and that's pretty funny, though. I mean, he comes off a bit pervy with this question to Chelsea. With Christina asking Chelsea why she hates people, that's notable. Michael, of all people, actually has a kind of notable speech here. His speech to Kim, telling her that she took all the blame for the blind sides. I thought that was kind of entertaining. You also have Alicia being extremely overconfident, but I mean, that's what you get from Alicia. You have Troyzan coming off as really bitter and asks for the moment that Kim ruined his chances of winning the game, which I'm kind of surprised that they even showed on the show, considering he was referring to a moment where Kim supposedly cheated. But again, there's a decent amount of memorable moments here. The main reason I have it as low as it is because I feel like the two moments that take up so much screen time from this final tribal are two moments that I don't find that entertaining. The first is the Tarzan speech, which, I mean, has its Tarzanisms, and that's fun. But like outside of that, him talking about how much he loves his wife and everything. It's like, why are we being shown? Why is he saying this at Final Tribal? The other one being Kat's really emotional speech, which, I mean, like, you would not expect that from Kat, and I do think that is interesting in its own right. But again, something I don't find, like, particularly entertaining, especially from a Final Tribal perspective. Not really something that I felt like needed to be there for me personally. So because of that, did feel like there were a couple slow points in this finale that knock it down for me. It's here at number 29. At number 28, we're moving on to a pretty solid Final Tribal, that being Survivor Cook Islands. Now, I do think the biggest issue of this Final Tribal is that there are definitely dud questions here. I mean, to be honest, that's kind of the issue with Cook Islands as a season in my eyes, is that like half the cast are duds, and it kind of translates this Final Tribal as well. But I do think during this Final Tribal, you do also have the intrigue of this Ozzy versus Yule battle, where both of them are taking very different approaches to this Final Tribal, where Ozzy is getting very emotional and trying to pull on people's heartstrings, while Yule doing a similar thing in terms of him talking about how he wanted to represent Asian men on TV. But like outside that, also takes a very analytical approach to Final Tribal, and I do think it's interesting to see this battle between the two of them there. You also have some fun questions here, like Nate's question to Becky. Really Becky's only notable moment here, where she completely bombs his question. You have some fun from Candace asking Yule a yes or no question, him struggling with that. You have Penner, who's always fun because he's Penner. I actually thought Adam, of all people, had a decent question as well. So like, again, it's mostly solid Final Tribal with some low points, which is why I still have to land it here at number 28. At number 27, we have a Final Tribal that is really just a step above Cook Islands for me, just barely above it, and that is Survivor Guatemala. Now, for me, the reason why it is above Cook Islands is because we do have a really notable, terrible performance here from Stephanie, where she's talking about how she couldn't take Lydia to the end because what does that say about her? Like, why would she want to take someone so weak to the end? She needs to take Danny. It's like, this is all really bad, but it is hilarious from a TV standpoint. Judd has a really great question, as you would expect from Judd, talking about how like Stephanie should be starving for his vote. And then you have like this debate over whether or not something is a lie, which I mean happens kind of often here and there on Final Tribals. But again, I do feel like it leads to some entertaining TV. Yeah, I feel like this is a Final Tribal that is pretty consistently entertaining the entire way through. Like, while there's definitely questions that aren't as great as others, I don't feel like I found it boring at any point. But it is that notable Stephanie performance that keeps it as high as it is here at number 27. At number 26, we're kind of at the end of another tier of the list. Again, this was kind of the tier of Final Tribals that are like kind of just fine. And that's really just how I feel about this one. That is Survivor Africa. It's fine. It's okay. Again, another Final Tribal that I think is really notable for Ethan's terrible Final Jury performance here. Again, the fact that he comes in this Final Tribal talking about how Brandon is a swing vote and he just completely bombs Brandon's question is hilarious. You also have like Tom, who is like ridiculous in his question here. You have like Kelly, who does the pick the number thing. Like, there's definitely notable moments here, especially because like I also feel like Kim Johnson actually has a decent performance. Like, well, at the end of the day, it's like Ethan was always winning here. I do think to see Ethan just completely bomb while Kim Johnson does pretty well, I do think it leads to a little bit of intrigue of like, oh, can Kim Johnson pull this out at the last second? So like, there's that as well. I mean, like, it's a fine Final Tribal. Like, it's nothing special, but again, notable moments there that put it here at number 26. Now, from this point on, again, I think the rest of these Final Tribals are all pretty good. I think we've kind of reached the baseline there. Again, I think Africa for me was kind of like very middle of the pack. I think everything beyond this does have a bevy of interesting moments. And let's start off at number 25. the worst of these tribals, in my opinion, is Survivor Palau. Now, Palau, I do think, is one of these kind of like Blood versus Water, where the final tribal itself is so focused on Katie and how much the jury hates Katie and bashes on Katie the entire time. But what puts it above Blood vs. Water for me is that I do feel like, one, the actual speeches themselves are more notable. Like, I feel like the people are a lot more harsh on Katie in this tribal. People like Karen, Greg, and Kobe all taking time out of their speeches to just bash on Katie. But I also feel like Katie just has more of a fight here, where she does try to undercut Tom. I mean, she does throw Tom under the bus to Stephanie. We also have her giving some interesting responses to someone like a Karen. We have her not even bothering to answer Janu's question. Like, I do think that's a lot of entertainment there. While Tom doesn't do anything of particular note here, I do feel like Katie kind of carries this final tribal, and that's why it's here at number 25. At number 24, we're moving on to a solid final tribal, and that is Survivor Philippines. And for me, I mean, this tribal is most known for the Penner speech, and I do think that is the best moment of this tribal. He gives such a great speech where he talks about how, like, Denise can be looked at as a bitch. We have him talking to Scoopin about how he's never gotten his name written down. He might have a perfect record after tonight. We have him revealing Lisa's backstory. We have him talking about how one has ridden the other two like oxen. And again, that's great. Again, Penner gives a fantastic speech here. And for me, that is the most notable moment here. Outside of him, you do have a couple other notable moments. You do have Abby being pretty bitter at all three of them. You have Malcolm going really hard on Denise in his question. We have Carter being really bland, but so bland that it's funny. We have artists talking about how they have a holier-than-thou attitude. Again, there's some bitterness in this final tribal that I did find pretty entertaining. But again, that Penner moment really stands out above everything else. And really, the reason why it's not higher is not really indictment on this final tribal, more so I just overall find other ones more entertaining as a whole. And with that, we move on to number 23, the final tribal from my favorite season of all time. We do have the final tribal from Survivor Kageon, which is good, but not particularly great in any way. I mean, this is a final tribal that has a couple things going on. First, you have Tony and his really terrible final tribal performance here, where he doesn't really own up to his game, and he does get into a couple confrontations with him trying to rationalize his moves to the jury members, which isn't a great look. Like, he has a confrontation with Jeffra, he has a confrontation with Jeremiah, with LJ. We obviously have the Trish question, which is a really heartbreaking speech there. And we also have Spencer's David Murphy speech at the end, where, again, really props up Tony, but then compares Wu to a dog, which is another thing. And Wu in particular in this final tribal is really trying to play on that loyalty card, which ends up being ineffective. Like, it's a fine final tribal, and I think it is a very confrontational final tribal where a lot of people are angry at Tony, and while again they end up voting for him, they do kind of want to express their anger, and I do feel like that is the most entertaining part of this final tribal, especially when Tony doesn't handle it well. But for me, that wasn't enough to really place it much higher on the list here than number 23. At number 22, we have probably one of the more rushed final tribals in the history of the show, and that is Survivor Worlds Apart, where this is the first final tribal where they don't even get opening statements. This is the first one where we have like this first jury member kind of wasting his question to tell the other players what the jury wants from them. We have Joe telling Will to man up. And really, I was actually surprised that this is probably the most entertainment I've gotten from Joe ever on the show, where he does kind of have a fun energy during his speech here. I also find it funny that the editing like cuts to Dan every single time Mike talks and shows Dan just shaking his head, and that's kind of funny. We have Jen giving a David Murphy speech about how bitter the jury is and how they should vote for Mike. I did feel like Tyler also had a fun energy to his question as well. Dan, I mean, he's such a ham in his final tribal. It's hilarious. I mean, his really bitter speech towards Mike, where like immediately afterwards he goes to sit down, then like Mike apologizes to him, and then Dan decides to get back up. It's all like a perfect encapsulation of what Dan is as a character, and to me it's just hilarious. And you obviously have Shireen's dead fish speech, which is pretty notable as well, and kind of playing it up for the camera, but it is a fun moment. And really, this is a fun final tribal. I think the problem with it comes from the fact that it is so fast paced and there are almost no questions. I think it might be the final tribal in the history of the show where the players themselves get to talk the least as a whole, but it is still a really fun Final Tribal at the end of the day. It does land here at number 22. At number 21, we are at Survivor San Juan del Sur. San Juan del Sur is good. I mean, I think there's, again, this is one of those that, like, it has some really notable moments for me, but can come off as, like, kind of at certain other points, kind of just baseline. But you do have, like, Natalie's response to Alec, which I thought was pretty fun, where, like, she really, like, blatantly butters up Alec, but, like, Alec just, like, soaks that in, and I always found that kind of funny. I always found Jeremy's, like, terrible David Murphy speech here just hilarious, where he's just talking about how Nat balled out. Gotta give it to her. Like, it's just so dumb, but it's hilarious. And then you have Reed's wicked stepmother speech. Again, a really notable one. Again, really hamming it up for the camera, but I do think it was a pretty fun way to end Final Tribal here. Again, this is a good Final Tribal. Like, it's completely solid. Again, like, for me, realistically, I do think Worlds Apart is probably stronger, but it doesn't have the pacing issues that Worlds Apart had. It doesn't have the issue of the players pretty much never getting to speak. It's like, there's more substance here, San Juan del Sur, and that's kind of what barely edged it out for me, and why it's here at number 21. Now, at number 20, we're on to another Final Tribal that has a couple really notable moments, and that is Survivor Gabon. Now, for me, Gabon does have its boring moments. I do think there are a couple questions that are pretty boring, but you also follow that up with some really iconic moments here. I mean, you obviously have Corinne's speech to Sugar that is extremely harsh, but something that is extremely notable. You also have her wanting to make a deal with Susie to have her remove her vocal cords. That's fun. You have Randy being pissed as ever, obviously, being upset at both Bob and Sugar. You have Kenny being really bitter at Bob, which I always found that storyline just really hilarious, considering, like, Kenny's upset Bob didn't give up his game for him. And I thought Maddie was actually surprisingly entertaining at Final Tribal as well. So it's, again, over half the questions are pretty good. You also have Randy's, like, kiss my ass confessional at the end, so that's fun as well. Again, it's a pretty good Final Tribal, but one I couldn't put that much higher because I did feel like the other questions that weren't mentioned here are just kind of But obviously, there's a lot of iconic stuff in this tribal, so that's why it's here at number 20. Now, at number 19, we're moving on to Final Tribal that I think is not as interesting from how the jury performs here, but more so interesting by how the players perform, and that is Survivor Thailand. Now, again, for me, I think Brian's performance and Clay's performance are both really interesting to watch here, but I think when we're looking at the actual jury members, again, you have like Jake, you have Aaron, you have Jan, all really boring. Not much of intrigue goes on there. You have like Penny asking Brian if he knows anything about her, and he just like completely whiffs on every question, and it's hilarious. You have Ken confronting Brian over his supposed racist comments that, again, wasn't aired on the show. And that entire confrontation is just very, very icky to watch, especially like now knowing kind of the context behind it. But I do think there's a lot of like question mark at the time, like what could they be talking about? You have Ted having a pretty decent speech calling out Brian and saying Clay is racist. And then you also have Helen, who is probably the most notable here, having a very bitter speech towards Brian. And really all this amounts to, again, like it's still over half the tribal that is pretty entertaining and very, very notable to me. Again, like for me, Gabon and Thailand are pretty much back to back. But I do think overall Brian and Clay's performances are more interesting to watch to me than Bob, Sugar, and Susie's. So for me, I did put Thailand above it, and it's here number 19. Now number 18, and this one's tough because this one was definitely higher when putting the list together, but I do feel like so much of this Final Tribal would have been bolstered solely because it is iconic, more so than the actual tribal itself is entertaining. So I did bump it a bit down, and at number 18, we do have the first Final Tribal ever. We have Survivor Borneo. Now, obviously, we have the Snakes and Rats speech. That is incredible, one of the greatest scenes in the history of television. However, outside of that, I think it's just fine. I mean, you have like Rudy getting up just to say one comment and sit back down. You have Greg's question about wanting them to pick a number. Again, that's interesting. You have like this debate between Colleen and Rich, where Rich like kind of articulates the game in a pretty interesting way there. Overall, like Rich's performance is pretty interesting to watch here, considering it very much sounds like he understands the fundamentals of the game of Survivor at this early point. But again, for me, I just couldn't justify putting it much higher, because I do feel like the main sticking point here is the snakes and rats speech, which is enough to put it this high. But I think when we factor in everything else, which is just kind of okay, I don't feel like it quite reaches the level of a lot of the other final tribals that we'll be talking about moving forward. So because of that, for me, I did feel like it was proper to leave it back here at number 18. Now number 17, we're on to a final tribal that kind of starts this string of tribals we're going to be talking about that are definitely filled with a lot of bitterness, and that bitterness being like one of the fundamental reasons why these tribals are entertaining. And at number 17 here, we do have one that is extremely reliant on how bitter the jury members are, and that is Survivor heroes versus villains, where again, so much of the jury is bitter. Now, who are they bitter at? That varies per person, but you obviously have a lot of bitterness towards Russell, and Russell does a particularly bad job at dealing with the people here. You have him like getting in that confrontation with Danielle. You have him getting in a confrontation with JT. You have him talking about how he didn't have any luck in the game and how it was all his own doing, and Colby calls him delusional, and like that's all really great. Then you also have a lot of bitterness towards Parvati, where Parvati gets lumped in with Russell, and you have Candace calling her a woman in an abusive relationship. You have even Sandra getting some bitterness. I mean, Coach in particular seems very bitter at Sandra. You have Rupert saying that like Russell took the easy way out in the game by playing a manipulative game. It's like there's a lot of bitterness at this final tribal, and that is the main reason it is so high. I do think overall there aren't that many like standout moments here. Like there's nothing like the snakes and rats speech. There's nothing like Corinne's speech. There's nothing like Helen's speech. Like the tribals that we've just talked about do have like more standout individual moments, but I do think as a whole, the bitterness that contains this entire tribal is very entertaining to me, and that's why it's here at number 17. At number 16, we're moving on to another tribal that does have a level of bitterness to it, not nearly as engulfed in bitterness, but is still one that does have some notable moments to it, and that is Survivor Micronesia. Now, Micronesia for me, again, has some bitterness with James. James is pretty bitter at Parvati and is like really annoyed by her response to his question. You have Sari being pretty bitter at Amanda, and Amanda answering her question really terribly. You obviously have Ozzy in his really cringy speech that's just so hilarious, talking to Parvati about how can you be a role model and I don't want to talk to you. Again, just really over the top acting and editing here as well. Like it's just hilarious. You also have Natalie's question about Parv in the bedroom, and like that's fun. I mean, like, to me, again, this is a fun final tribal. I mean, Eliza is Eliza, so I mean, that's cool as well. I mean, like, this is fun. I do like Micronesia's final tribal. I think others stand out in the grand scheme of things, but it's still a pretty fun one at the end of the day. It's here at number 16. At number 15, this was a tough final tribal to really assess for me, but I did feel like while the tribal itself had a very clear direction, I do feel like there's a lot of entertainment within it to make it stand out, and that is Survivor Caramoan. Now, as I said, like, Cochrane's winning this. Like, it's very clear. Like, they don't even try to hide it in any way. But, I mean, I think even outside of that, Cochrane has a pretty good performance here. Now he butters up Malcolm and Eddie. Sherry ends up getting a lot of hate in this final tribal, and that leads to her having a really terrible performance that's really fun to watch, especially like when Eric starts to talk to her and like she says, "That's your opinion, Eric. I'm done with you. You can sit down." Like, it's all really great. You do have some fun back and forth between Cochrane and Don at points where Cochrane tries to take credit for everything Don did, and Don obviously refutes that. You have Reynold, who has a fun energy at Final Tribal where he wants her to shoot it to him straight. And then obviously you have Brenda wanting Don to take her teeth out, which is a super notable moment. I don't find it entertaining though. Again, it just feels very icky to me, but it is something that does make this Final Tribal stand out. And because of all those things, again, like, it is a very entertaining tribal at the end of the day. It's here at number 15. And now at number 14, we're moving into a string of Final Tribals with the modern format. And I feel like these three all take advantage of this new format pretty well. So at number 14 here, we do have Survivor Heroes versus Healers versus Hustlers where I feel like this is a good tribal mainly because of Ryan. I feel like Ryan goes so hard at this tribal with him trying to essentially lie about how much control he had in the game. And it does come off as somewhat effective, though he does go super hard in going against Chrissy, leading to them arguing between themselves for a good chunk of the tribal. I do think both Ryan and Chrissy fight pretty hard in this final tribal, and that is super fun to watch. I do knock it down a bit I do feel like Ben doesn't really do much here. Like, while he obviously does end up winning, and like, to be fair, he didn't really need to do much, as I do feel like he had the votes that he was going to get on lock anyway, he doesn't end up doing much this final tribal, and actually, like, I would say overall has a pretty mediocre performance. But you still have that bickering that I do want from the modern final tribal format, with like Chrissy and Ryan arguing the entire way through, and because of that, for me, it's still entertaining enough to put it here at number 14. At number 13, again, another modern tribal, the first with the new format. We do have Survivor Game Changers, which I was actually surprised at how entertaining I found this tribal to be. I do think it was interesting to see the dichotomy between Sarah and Brad's games, where we had these very clear camps on the jury of people supporting Sarah, people supporting Brad. We had people like Zeke, Suri, and Michaela fighting for Sarah. We had people like Ozzy and Debbie fighting for Brad. And then we had a lot of people in the middle that I do think added a decent amount of intrigue to this final tribal. People like Andrea talking about she feels gross voting for Sarah. We do have like Brad being asked personal questions about Michaela and not really knowing much about her, and that was a fun back and forth. Really, just Brad in general has a lot of fun interactions in this final tribal. You also have like Sarah really owning her game here. You have Troyzan in his final speech, which I always found pretty memorable, with him obviously having the awareness that they're clearly not voting for him, but I do feel like he gives a pretty heart-wrenching speech there about how much Survivor means to him. Again, I think that's great. I overall really like Game Changers' final tribal here, and it lands here at number 13. Now, number 12, again, another modern final tribal, and that is Survivor Ghost Island. Now, there's a couple reasons why this one is higher than the other two. The first of which is that, we obviously have this massive battle between Dominic and Wendell that ends up leading in the first ever tie, where Laurel ends up being the deciding vote. Again, that's all super entertaining. Dom in particular gives a really dynamic final tribal performance here, where I do feel like he really owns his game, and I felt like that was entertaining to watch. I do think Dominic comes off as a bit too domineering in this final tribal, but I do think that makes for, again, entertaining TV in my eyes. We do have some bitterness as well, like Sebastian coming off as bitter towards Dominic, along with like Kellen. We do also have some fun interactions from the jury, where like Dominic calls out Wendell for not initiating the bond with Laurel and Donathan, to which Donathan supports Dominic in that. And again, that's fun as well. Again, there's definitely a fun energy of this final tribal. And with it being this like massive battle between these two like giants of the game, to where again, you have no clue who's going to win this. It's not like a certain other final tribal that we'll be talking about very soon. Here with Ghost Island, it's like you legitimately have no clue who the jury is actually going to vote for. And I do think that leads to a bolstered opinion of this final tribal, but I do think at the end of the day, it's not nearly as memorable as the other tribal I am referring to, and that's why Ghost Island lands here at number 12. Now, at number 11, the final tribal that I was referring to, and this kind of starts a string of final tribals with the old format of the show that kind of play as if they are with the modern format. And to start that off here at number 11, we do have Survivor Tocantins. Again, a very similar final tribal from Ghost Island, where it is this battle between JT and Steven. The massive difference here is that JT has already won the battle, and there really is no real debate here. JT was always winning this, but you do still have a lot of bickering between the two that does get really entertaining. Again, like this tribal and the next couple we'll talk about very much play like the current format, where the current format is one that leads to a lot more dynamic of conversations, leads to it being a real debate between the players. And I do feel like Tocantins is one of these final tribals that already kind of feels like that. Again, there's a lot of fighting between JT and Steven, with really JT just completely outplaying Steven at every opportunity during this final tribal, really sucking up to the jury, really making him look like a sympathetic figure. The questions themselves are not particularly memorable here. Not that they're bad, but it's just like, again, not much of actual consequence stems from the questions themselves. It's more so, again, the arguments between JT and Steven and how JT ends up undercutting Steven at every opportunity. That does make this final tribal as entertaining as it is. And I do think JT's performance here is just really interesting to watch for me as well, especially in comparison to that of like a Wendell or a Dominic. So that's why for me it lands above it, and it's here at number 11. Now at number 10, we're at the top 10 of the list, and we're moving on to another tribal that, again, has a very similar vibe to me from Tocantins. Again, another older final tribal that does have a similar level of dynamic debate that you would see from a modern final tribal, and that is Survivor China. Now, again, there's a lot of bickering here between Todd, Amanda, and even Courtney at points. Like, they're all playing pretty hard at the final tribal here, especially towards the end of it, particularly when Jamie asks her question, which really allows for the players to have a bit more of an open discussion there. We do also have, through his tribal, obviously Amanda's really notable bad performance, where again, she comes into this tribal being in a potentially winning situation if she gives a good enough final tribal performance, but she just doesn't. We also have Todd's really great final tribal performance and how he handles Jean Robert, which is incredible. Again, just a really hilarious scene as well. But overall, really great final tribal here. Again, a lot of fun arguing between the players. Again, something that does feel a bit ahead of its time, and it does land here at number 10. Now at number 9, the top of these older format final tribals that, again, feel like modern final tribals. And a lot of that comes from the fact that this is still a modern final tribal, and that is Survivor Millennials versus Gen X, the final tribal before they switch to the modern format. And again, it very much feels like it's part of this modern format anyway. Again, like as I was talking about, I do feel like the older format, while I do really like it, I do feel like by the time we got to like Millennials vs. Gen X, it was pretty clear that that format was getting a bit stale on the US version of the show, where it does feel like a lot of the questions just became very irrelevant. And the show was just like kind of speeding through them and felt very forced to show all these people that didn't really add much to the conversation. Like, I do think at the end of the day, I do get why they switch final tribal formats, but Millennials vs. Gen X here, again, like ends on a high note. I do think this is a very strong final tribal. Again, the questions themselves don't really matter. The only really notable performance here is from Chris, where he advocates for Adam. But like outside of that, it's like everyone is just asking kind of baseline questions, but it's the responses from Hannah, Ken, and Adam that does make this tribal as great as it is. Again, there's a lot of Adam playing really hard at this final tribal, and then Hannah trying to rebut him. You have Ken even getting involved at a point where like Ken gets really upset that Adam's taking credit for the David move. And really Adam makes this final tribal. Again, like he plays super hard here to try to undercut Hannah and Ken at pretty much every opportunity, and that is pretty entertaining to watch. You do also have him revealing to the tribe about his mom's cancer, which is also very heartbreaking. So really Adam makes this final tribal to me, so he lands here at number 9. Now number 8, and here we have the top final tribal that, again, I would consider to be a more open discussion. From this point on, we're in the top tier for me of final tribals, which are top tier for a very different reason. But at number 8 here, we actually have a very recent final tribal, one that I really loved on the rewatch, and that is the final tribal from Survivor Island of the Idols. And this final tribal to me is really, really fun. Again, there's a lot of fun back and forth between the players here, with Tommy and Dean both propelling very different styles of gameplay, where like Tommy is going for a more social and strategically dominant gameplay, while Dean is going for very vantage heavy and underdog style of gameplay. And in between, we also have Nora, who has no chance of winning here, but is also still fighting and is still undermining Dean at almost every opportunity, and even undermines Tommy at a point. We also have this like funny moment where like Nora tries to compare things to a date, to which the entire jury laughs at her, which is hilarious. I think Dean as a whole has a really fun energy at this final tribal, which I do think is effective for a little while, but then he eventually starts to get called out, and it's hilarious that when that happens, it starts pouring on them, which is fun symbolism there. Like, again, this is a really fun final tribal. I did really like the back and forth between everything. How could I forget the moment where like Dean talks about making the fake legacy advantage, which the legacy advantage itself ends up being fake as well, and like Jamal tries to play it up as like, oh, look at Dean, he's doing something great, and like that's also funny to me. Again, like there's a lot of fun stuff here. I love Island of the Idols final tribal here. It lands at number 8. And now we're on to the top 7, and again, like for me, this top 7 is the top tier, mainly because of how notable these final tribals are. And to be honest, a lot of these final tribals are based around bitterness. Like there's a lot of bitterness in these final tribals, and for me personally, that is something I always found the most entertaining from final tribal councils, especially when you have these speeches that are solely based around bitterness. Like I just always personally found that entertaining in final tribals. So again, very few of these final tribals are actually this high based on the gameplay within them, but more so off of how fun they are to me personally. And at number 7 here, we do have, again, a tribal that is notoriously known for having a lot of bitterness, and that is Survivor Samoa. Now, I actually don't think this final tribal actually has that much bitterness within it. Like, obviously, this is a season that, like, it's known for, oh, the jury was bitter against Russell, but it's like, you don't actually see that much bitterness here against Russell in this final tribal. But you do also see some really great moments. I mean, you have, like, Shambo calling Mick feckless and calling Natalie a coattail rider, and it's like stuff like that's really fun. You have this really awkward question from Brett with him asking Mick about what they would do in a bro date, and that's really weird. You have Kelly and her question to Russell, which I thought was really interesting, where she doesn't believe that he cares about honesty and loyalty outside of the game, which is like, why not? Again, like it's really strange watching tribals like this in the modern day. As much as people like to bash on Russell, it's like, I actually think Russell has like a competent final tribal performance here, and one that I do think gives him the win in a modern season. But obviously here it doesn't. But really for me, again, the most notable moment from this final tribal has to be the Cardona speech. Eric Cardona really propping up Natalie's game, calling out Russell for his arrogance, calls out Mick for his delusional entitlements. Like, again, it's a really great speech. The first really of these speeches where someone goes up there solely to prop up a single player. Again, something that we hadn't really seen up to this point, and really becomes the standard moving forward. Again, a pretty influential final tribal here, and one that is also pretty notable to me, so it lands here at number 7. At number 6 is a final tribal that I kind of forgot was this fun, and to me, there was actually a debate for putting this much higher, because like I had so much fun watching this final tribal. Despite this season being pretty boring, despite the result being one that, again, was very obvious, I did love the final tribal of Redemption Island. And really a lot of that is because of Philip. Like, Philip is incredible in this final tribal. And we have great opening statements here from both Natalie and Philip, where they pretty much give all the credit to Boston Rob. We have Andrea calling Philip weird, and she like tries to ask him about all the different versions of him, to which he like instantly gets super confrontational back to her, which again is kind of the standard for Philip moving forward. Natalie also gets called out for her like creepy relationship with Boston Rob throughout this tribal. You have Ashley being sick of Philip, and again, he's also confrontational to her. You also have like Julie getting super personal in her final question, which I did not particularly like. But again, does lead to a fun back and forth between her and guess who? Philip. And he ends up saying to hell with you at the end of it. Like, that's fun. We also have Philip talking about his social game and how no one knew he was close to Boston Rob, and everyone just starts laughing. We have Steve saying that he's like sorry for Philip and calls him a sorry man. Again, that's great. Again, like, all really great. I really love everything Philip does in this final tribal. Really great TV. And then you also have the David Murphy speech at the end, which is again is a really memorable moment here, where his entire speech is there to prop up Rob and try to make sure the jury votes for Rob, even though again they're voting for Rob anyway. But again, very entertaining final tribal to me. Lands here at number 6. Now number 5, we have another final tribal. This one kind of on the opposite end of things for Boston Rob. We do have Survivor All Stars. Again, the complete opposite of Boston Rob here, where again, Redemption Island, it's the jury being bitter at everyone but Boston Rob there. Here, the jury is extremely bitter at Boston Rob. This is, to me, is a very iconic final tribal, one that I always enjoyed watching. And from when I was a kid, like Pearl Islands and All Stars are 2 seasons I remember the most, and I really remember this final tribal. So because I do have a bit of a connection to it. I mean, Rob, in general, just gets completely bashed on the entire way. And like the level of bitterness from this jury is really notable to me. Again, you obviously started off with Lex, with him saying that Rob sold out their friendship. You have Kathy being really emotional, saying that Rob was like a son to her. You have Alicia talking about how Rob and Amber are both butt kissers and ego strokers. You have Tom having that really notable speech and him following that up with him pretending to want a handshake with Rob only for him to deny him and then say, "Don't be stupid, stupid." Again, like a really great moment for the show. I also really liked Rupert in this final tribal. Like that's something that for me, again, has always stood out to me, where Rupert asks Rob why he should vote for him, and Rob says, "Because you're a man of your word," and Rupert just starts laughing. I don't know. I always really liked that interaction for some reason. It is such a fantastic final tribal in my eyes. It's amazing TV, really emotional piece of television. But again, I really did enjoy this, and it is very iconic in my eyes. So because that All Stars ends up landing here at number 5. Now at number 4, and straight up, these top 4 for me, like they're interchangeable. There were definitely different points where each one of these were at number 1. I really took a decent amount of time thinking about where these should land. But here at number 4, I did end up putting Survivor Fiji. And Survivor Fiji is another one of these tribals that is completely engulfed in bitterness. Like there's a lot of bitterness towards Dreams and Cassandra during this final tribal that kind of feels unwarranted for the most part, but it is still really entertaining to watch. And we do have pretty notable bad performances here from Dreams and Cassandra. Cassandra in particular gives a terrible performance. She does have this pretty funny interaction with Michelle where she's essentially saying that she deserves the win because she doesn't know how to swim and she overcame that adversity. You do have the 4 horsemen being really bitter at Dreams, with Alex being the front runner in that. I always liked his line where he says, like, "Riddle me this, Dreams. You lie, you cheat, and you backstab," in relation to why he should be a role model. It's like, I always found that entertaining. You also have him being like really angry at Cassandra for like seemingly no reason, and I found that really funny as well. You also have Lacey, who is like ridiculous in this final tribal. Mind you, she does start off with like doing Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, which is not really in great taste considering the historical context of that. But she follows that up with being upset at Cassandra for her water shoes and talking about how Cassandra made it to the end because of greed, which is, again, ridiculous. She then asks, like, Dreams how many zeros there are in a million. Again, it's all dumb. Like, obviously, like, kind of icky in terms of how it's clear, like, how she looks at Dreams, Cassandra, but it is still humorous because it's coming from Lacey, this character I can't take seriously. Beyond this, we also have, like, Rocky wanting to know who's the biggest kicker. We have, like, Boo condemning Dreams, wanting Dreams' Christian answer over whether or not he was always going to backstab Yao. And really, this Dreams Yao conflict is obviously a major thing in this final tribal, which Dreams continues to lie about the entire way through, which is very questionable from a strategic standpoint, but again, very entertaining to watch. I really love Survivor Fiji's final tribal, very iconic to me. Again, a lot of bitterness there. Again, it is that kind of icky feeling, though, at points that does leave it out of the top 3 for me, but it is something I do still find very entertaining. Now number 3, and again, like for me, these top 3, very interchangeable. I don't think there's that much difference between the 3. This is still a very good final tribal. But at number 3, I do have Survivor Vanuatu, the final of these like really old school final tribals. And this is a really great one. Again, like a lot of this is based around Chris and how he performs here, where he really just BS's the jury into a win, and a lot of that is really entertaining. We do have a really great speech from Eliza calling Twyla a deceptive, lying bitch, and that's fun. Julie gives a really emotional question here, to which Chris really plays it up in a really entertaining way, but also in a way that is very good gameplay-wise. He really just butters up the jury, and it is entertaining to watch. Same thing goes with his response to Sarge, where I thought Sarge had a pretty fun speech where he like lies about not voting for Chris, just to follow that up with like spending his entire speech bashing on Twyla, which like makes his previous statement make no sense. But then we have like, again, like Chris really hamming it up for his jury vote. I love how the entire tribal ends with like Scout just calling out Chris for his entire BS the entire way. Like, it is pretty fun. Again, like, I love Chris's performance here. It's a lot of what makes this tribal as great as it is. I think the one thing that does knock it down for me, the reason it is below the top 2, is because I do think there is a bit of a lull in the tribal. I mean, Chad's question isn't particularly interesting. Both Leanne and Amy kind of spend their time kind of just being angry at Twyla, and I didn't find that to be the most entertaining thing in the world, especially considering Twyla had already gotten so much hate from the rest of the tribal. It's like, I don't feel like they really added that much to the tribal to where, like, again, like, this is still a fantastic tribal. It's number 3 on the list, but I feel like those little nitpicks kind of put it down here at number 3. Now number 2, and again, these top 2 are very close. They're both from a very similar period in Survivor history, and they both are very high for very similar reasons. They're both tribals that are filled with bitterness, but are also tribals that have pretty open discussions, especially considering the time period they took place in. Again, with the old Final Tribal format, I think they're both very, very entertaining Final Tribals from multiple perspectives. But at number 2 here, again, very close between the top 2 here, but I decided to go with Survivor South Pacific. Now, this is, again, a fantastic Final Tribal, mostly because a couple things. I mean, you have Sophie, and I think her giving a very impressive Final Tribal performance, one that is, again, I think ahead of her time in how much she spends kind of bashing on Coach and Albert over actively propping up her game. She just talks about how, like, Coach is her young girl that she dragged through the game. She talks about how she was Coach's strategist, and, like, that leads to a fun moment as well with Albert, where, like, Albert tries to take credit for being a strategist as well, but then comes off as, like, super meek during that moment. And Albert in general is fantastic to be in this Final Tribal as well, with him really trying to play up this, like, smooth talking political figure within the tribe, and then just completely gets trounced on. Like, you have, like, Jim asking him to answer a question without giving any compliments, and then Albert literally starts it with the compliment. You have Brandon's question where Albert is so wishy-washy here, with him not being able to tell Brandon that he knew he was going home. And again, just a terrible look for Albert here. I also found the moment where, like, Whitney calls Albert sleazy pretty funny, because, like, you have this reaction for Albert where he's, like, confused at, like, what's going on. It's like, I always found Albert during this Final Tribal to be really hilarious to watch. But then you also have Coach, who just straight up doesn't own his game here, in a position where he probably wins the game if he does. He tries to still lean on the honesty and loyalty and the religion and all that stuff that really just makes him come off as super hypocritical. So really, again, it's a consistently fun Final Tribal the entire way through. The only reason it's not higher is because I do feel like number 1 has a lot more bitterness in it from more of the players on the cast. And that is the slight difference that makes South Pacific here land at number 2. Now, number 1, the best Final Tribal in my eyes is, again, one that has a lot of bitterness within it, but it also has a level of gameplay within it as well. And that is Survivor Nicaragua, where, again, I love this Final Tribal. There's so much bitterness in this Final Tribal the entire way through. You start off with Brenda being really bitter at Sash for some reason, which makes no sense in context of Brenda actually targeting Sash at that point in the game. So it's like, I don't understand why Brenda was bitter at Sash, but that's a thing. And you have, like, Sash trying to call Chase out for not doing more to save Brenda, when it's like, Sash literally had an idol in his pocket. It's like, what are you talking about? You have Marty's performance, which is really great, where he wants Chase to hand out the Dumber Than a Bag of Hammers award, to which Chase gives it to Marty, which is fun. We have Jane calling Sash a New York sewer rat. We have Benry calling Sash out for his fake laugh. Dan has a really fantastic speech where he calls Sash a liar, a phony, and spineless, talking about how he hates that smile. Again, it's really fun. You have him then berating Chase, talking about how he's the most paranoid player out there and that there's a lot of people bleeding out there because of him. Talks about beauty fades, but dumb is forever. Again, like, really great speech from Dan Lembo. Again, that's like over half of the jury members with actively bitter jury speeches, but then even beyond that, we get some entertainment from the back and forth between players. There's a lot of back and forth between Fabio, Chase, and Sash, with them trying to undercut each other along the way. Fabio gives a really great answer to Nyanka's question that ends up leading to a lot of the jury members crying, and that's pretty interesting. Alina gives kind of a question similar to what Jamie did back in the Survivor China finale, where it really opens it up for Fabio, Chase, and Sash to start arguing within each other. And again, that's a lot of fun. There's a lot of fun gameplay within this final tribal to me that goes along with all the bitterness that really makes it, for me, a pretty perfect final tribal, and it lands here at number 1. And there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every final tribal in the history of Survivor US. Now, as I said, this is only the first in a series of videos I'm going to be doing in relation to the Survivor finales. Again, near the time of the Survivor 41 finale, I will be doing a ranking of every finale in the history of the show. But before that, there are 2 other rankings I want to do as well that I know I've been recommended to do at times, and I'm finally going to do them. I'm finally going to be ranking every final tribal performance in the history of the show. Now, it will be split up into 2 videos. I'll be doing one for winners and then the other one for losing final tribal performances. So that is something coming up later down the road. But for now, that is my ranking of the final tribals in Survivor history. Thank you for watching.